It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The IMF has upgraded growth. Wages are up, inflation is down.
Keir Starmer says he can turn around the economy. The Bank of England has just cut interest rates. When will people feel better off? And a policy announcement on immigration from Kemi Badenoch.
UK passports are a privilege. Citizenship in our country are a privilege, not just a right. And we need to make sure that the people who are coming here want to have a real, meaningful connection to the UK.
The Tory leader pledges to bar low-paid migrants from settling here indefinitely. Also on the programme...
You love your family, and then you love your neighbour, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then, after that, you can focus and prioritise the rest of the world.
Donald Trump and his vice president want to cut the US aid department. What should happen to the aid budget here? And with local councils struggling for money, are your bins going to be emptied less often? Joining us today, Labour MP Jim Dixon, Shadow Culture Secretary Stuart Andrew, Eleanor Shearer from the economic think tank Commonwealth, which backs public ownership, and Daily Telegraph columnist Annabel Denham. This is Politics Live. Let's start with this news headline announced shortly, just about 10 minutes ago. BBC News, Bank of England cuts interest rates to 4.5%, the lowest level since June 2023. It was expected. Well, it's now been confirmed. It's the third interest rate cut in 6 months. Good news for people with mortgages, less so for those with savings. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Jim, is when will people start to feel better off?
Well, I think this interest rate cut is incredibly good news for families in the UK. It will bring people's mortgages down from the peak seen under the last government. So that's great news. I think people are starting to feel better off. Real wages are up by the first time, for the first time in 3 years. The economy has generated an additional 70,000 jobs since the government got in. And we are rated as the second best place to invest by the Institute of Directors in the G7.
So you think living standards are already improving?
They are already improving,
okay.
And we are very focused as a government in trying to get more money into the pockets of working people, but families across the country. Our Make Work Pay campaign was already, with the increase in the living wage and the increase in the minimum wage, seeing people better off.
Stuart, Andrew, do you agree? Are people starting to feel better off, or when will they?
I certainly don't think they are feeling better off at all. I mean, the reality is that we saw in the budget some major tax rises that are impacting a lot of the businesses that are the people that create the jobs. And, you know, the businesses that I've been speaking to in my constituency are really struggling to find where they're going to get that money from. It is a huge burden on them.
But do you welcome the cut in interest?
Of course I welcome any cut in interest rates. Of course I do. But I think there is a long way to go. Business confidence is low and has been falling since the budget. And that worries me about the wider economic prosperity for the people of this country. I want them to feel better off, but I do worry that you aren't going to be able to achieve that if you're taxing the people who create the jobs in the first place.
Well, the interest rate cut is the third rate cut in a row. The latest inflation figures are still above the Bank of England target of 2%. When do you think people will start to feel better off?
I think it's a good question because the public is really clear on this in terms of their priorities. You know, they want to see action on the cost of living, and Labour aren't going to be rewarded if that action isn't taken. There's two things I'd say. The first is about interest rates. So our monetary policy is not a good tool for fighting the inflation that we have experienced. The problem is that inflation has come from supply chain shocks, it's come from economic instability, and so interest rates shouldn't have been allowed to get so high and shouldn't have been kept here for so long. It's caused people pain, but it hasn't actually addressed the underlying causes of this inflation. And then the second thing I'll just say is about Labour's growth plan, because it's very welcome that the government has a growth plan, but at the moment a lot of the returns to that are quite long term. People want to see action on the cost of living here and now, and that's what they're going to be rewarded for.
Just before I come to you, Andrew, do you accept that? You know, the plans for GB Energy, for example, they are all very much into the future.
I think businesses and overseas investors can see the government saying yes to infrastructure projects rather than no, as the last government did. They can see things like the Lower Thames crossing in my constituency being given the go-ahead, an extra runway for Heathrow. Those are all things that make investors feel the UK is up and running, open for business.
Or will be in about 10, 20 years.
Well, no, but those are things which actually make a difference now, because once you get construction underway, you generate growth, you generate jobs, and you start to get that feel-good buzz around the UK economy that helps to generate growth.
Annabelle, the interest rate cut, first of all, is that a welcome move by the Bank of England? Perhaps the Bank of England governor does have his eye on growth too.
Quite possibly. It is, of course, a welcome move. It's good news for mortgage holders. It's good news that the Bank of England is not restricting demand in the economy quite so much as it has been. But ultimately, monetary policy over the last couple of years has been a complete mess. The Bank of England was far too slow to raise interest rates after billions of pounds were pumped into our economy in order to pay for lockdowns and other COVID measures. So it's too slow then. And there's a real risk that it was actually too slow to act in lowering interest rates, because there is a delay in terms of when the impact of those interest rates cuts are really felt. All that being said, we don't yet know what the impact of the October budget is going to be in terms of inflation, and there are very real risks that it is going to increase as costs for businesses inevitably rise.
Right, but do you agree with Jim Dixon that people are already starting to feel better off?
It may well be that real wages are increasing, but so are taxes. We're set to have the highest tax burden in 7 decades by the end of this Parliament. So, and growth is pretty much stagnant. It might be increasing by 0.1% one month, but it'll be going down by 0.1% the next. And without growth in the economy, of course, people aren't going to expect their real living standards to improve.
Right, well, and the government is continuing on its push in terms of growth. This is an announcement today. UK to make it easier to build nuclear reactors. It has been talking about deregulation in general. Is it going to actually bring higher rates of growth than have been forecast?
Well, we need to decarbonise our energy system. We're spending a lot to invest in renewables, and nuclear is a key part of that mix. If you make it easier to build big infrastructure like nuclear power plants, like the sorts of infrastructure you need to create a decarbonised energy system, you get returns in terms of lower fuel bills and actually lower energy bills for industry, which are incredibly important. If I could just pick...
When we'll see lower energy bills is, again, sometime into the future.
I think reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and the sorts of countries that provide fossil fuels and the fact that you can't actually control the international price will be very important. And actually, with renewables, you can.
Well, let me get the... Stuart, do you agree?
So, look, I really want to see investment in nuclear. I think it is an important thing for our country, for our energy security. But I do think there is a bit of a mismatch with the government's energy policy. You look at the missed opportunities for growth with the oil and gas issue. I think there are thousands of jobs there that could be, bring about real growth and opportunity for serious parts of this country, and they are ignoring that opportunity.
Well,
so
they may well say yes, of course,
other.
to the licences that were granted at Rosebank, although they've been held up to some extent. They sound like they're going to go ahead with it anyway.
But we haven't had any clarity, and I think that doesn't give confidence to the businesses that are thinking about their future in that area.
Are you in favour of this deregulation push to get growth?
I think it's not the whole story. I think that the government so far is focused on some really important infrastructure projects, but we mustn't forget that the economy is not abstract. It's made up of all of us. And the economy does well when people have money in their pockets, when they're healthy, when they have access to housing that doesn't bankrupt them, and when they can access public transport. All of these things are essential, and at the moment, the government hasn't really said much. In fact, they've been talking about making further cuts to public services. And those, as we know from the last 15 years, are a false economy. It might look like it saves money here and now, but it makes all of us poorer and more insecure in the long term. That's the economic foundation we need to be focusing on as much as these infrastructure projects.
Well, let's pick up on some of that. In the Times, millions face council tax rise of more than 5%. So Jim Dixon may say people are feeling better off than they were, but this is obviously coming down the track. Bills in most areas are set to rise by 5%, although in 6 areas, including Bradford, Birmingham and Somerset, they've been given permission to rise or increase the bills to 10%. And at the same time, services are being cut. 5 million face cuts to bin collections, say campaigners. One council expects to save more than £2 million and another is giving residents smaller bins. Justified when councils are strapped for cash?
No, I don't think so, and I can't imagine it will go down particularly well with local residents. What I think we need to separate is environmental zealotry from the problems that a lot of councils are currently facing and the reasons why they're having to increase council tax. Now, a large part of the problem is the fact that the social care can keeps being kicked further and further down the road. Governments are refusing, successive governments have refused to grasp the nettle and fix the problems that are ailing the social care sector. At the same time, there's been decreasing funds for local authorities. So there's immense pressure on them at the same time as demand is only increasing.
So would you be in favour of more money going to local councils to deal with these pressures?
Were the government willing to cut spending at the central government level, then quite possibly. But I don't want to see the tax burden increasing overall. It's more a case of, where the money is being raised and where it's being spent. But it's not just social care. There's the fact that £1 in 4 pounds which go towards council tax are spent on gold-plated pensions for local bureaucrats, for instance. That's something else that they've got to fix, as well as the millions that are squandered every year by local authorities on the pet projects of those who are working within them.
Jim?
Well, I think there's two things going on here. I think the first is we are dealing with a legacy of 14 years in which the local government finance system was progressively broken. And there was a very instructive moment in the Commons chamber just before Christmas when the last local government minister of the Conservative government stood up and said, the system is broken. What is the Labour government going to do to fix it? And actually one of the things we are doing to fix it is this year there are record increases in investment in local government services. So there's an extra £5 billion going in on top of the council tax that they can raise, £69 billion altogether available to local government.
So why are they needing to put up council tax by so much?
Well, as I say, we are fixing a legacy of local authorities which have gone bankrupt. There are a record number of councils declaring bankruptcy in the last year of the Conservative government. It will take a while to fix that, but extra investment is part of the story, and the sort of extra investment we're seeing going in homelessness, in waste management, in a whole variety of other areas, I think give us hope that we can get our local authorities out of this.
Well, do you want to say sorry, Stuart Andrew, on behalf of Conservative governments that successively cut central government budgets to local councils?
Well, what really staggers me about this is that literally just before the election, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and others said time and time again that there would be a freeze on council tax. Then they get elected and look what happens. We're seeing these real huge hikes happening in some of the most challenging areas. And a big chunk of this money will also have to go on paying that national insurance increase that we've seen, that jobs tax. So not just with council tax, council employers, that'd be about 600 million, but another 600 million on the people that are providing those services, those social care services, etc. The other thing that worries me is the impact that this is going to have on charities up and down the country. So they're saying that it's going to cost about £1.4 billion for the charity sector. When you talk about homelessness, most councils rely on the third sector to deliver their obligations on tackling homelessness. And those charities are saying that about £60 million will be lost from the front line due to this jobs tax that the Chancellor introduced in her budget.
I mean, how justified is it to cut people's bin collections? For most people, that is how they see their council as a sort of core function of your local authority.
Yeah, I absolutely do think it's a political problem because council tax itself is the elephant in the room, that it's an incredibly regressive tax. It's pinned to 1991 property prices that mean there are huge regional distortions. A Band H property in Hartlepool is paying almost twice as much as a Band H property in Westminster.
And nobody has ever really wanted to take on that mantle of rebranding, have they?
No one has wanted to take on the political opportunity as well, because there are beneficiaries from council tax reform as much as there will be people that might be cross about their bills going up. But I think the point is that an economist would say council tax is a property tax. But most of us, when we pay our council tax, we see it as paying towards the running of local services. But because of, I think it's really hard to overstate the acute nature of the crisis in local government funding. You know, the Local Government Association estimates it's about £25 billion worth of services cuts since 2010. And Local councils are the way that we feel the fabric of our communities, their services. We're talking about roads, we're talking about libraries, we're talking about community centres. It's no wonder that so many people are looking around and saying, my local area feels worse off, because councils are struggling to just make their basic duties with social care. So I think it absolutely is a crisis. Council tax is a really poor way to be dealing with it, and we need to be looking at the funding arrangement overall.
Well, and we've just seen pictures of those bin collections. How are you going to explain to your constituents if they are told that instead of every fortnight, it's going to be once a month?
Well, I think just to come back on Eleanor's comment about the council tax, there aren't any plans to change it, but what we will do is continue the principle of only permitting council tax rises above 5% with a referendum. In terms of the Bristol issue and monthly
well, except for the exceptions, of course, that Angela Rayner has just
well,
found. I mean, she's going to put it up to 10. Well, she isn't. They're going to put it up to 10% in certain areas.
Those are exceptional councils where the average council tax bill is well below equivalent local authorities. But on the Bristol thing, we have to let local authorities run their own services. It all slightly reminds me, with a Green local authority here, of when they took over Brighton Council. They immediately precipitated a bin strike and recycling went down rather than up, and that's not really what people signed up for in voting Green in Brighton. And I think we've got the same thing going on here.
The data is pointing to 1 in 10 councils going to do the same sort of thing. How do you think people would respond, Jim?
I don't think any other councils will be looking at monthly bin collections, and I understand there is sufficient worry about fly tipping and mess around Bristol. This proposal is unlikely to go through. And I do say it shows you that I don't think the Green Party is really ready yet to take on the responsibility of running a local authority.
But this is happening under a central government, under Labour, and obviously Labour councils too will be considering it. How would your constituents feel if their bin collections are cut?
They'd be pretty angry about it.
Not cut altogether, of course, but cut.
But I remember a couple of years ago there was a proposal similar was made, and the outcry was enormous. I mean, people do expect to have the basics of having their rubbish collected on a regular basis as a part of the payments that they're making to those councils. So, you know, I think this is something that is not going to be accepted by local people.
Yeah, but how else then do councils save money? I mean, is it justifiable when they are, as Annabelle said, having to meet their statutory commitments on things like social care and education for children? The vast majority of council tax goes on those two things. How else do they save money?
Well, I think there is a whole host we were just hearing about a whole host of ways that money can be saved. It is incumbent on local councils constantly to be looking at their budgets, making sure that they are, you know, the salaries that they're offering are reasonable. I think some people get very, very angry when you see very large wage bills for some senior people in councils that are paid more than the Prime Minister.
Right.
That's just not acceptable.
Are they justifiable, those wage bills?
Well, I think you have to pay people who work in local authorities providing vital public services decently. Those who criticise the pay rates in local authorities will also be the first to point the finger when a child, for instance, is harmed as a result of adult social care and children's social care departments not doing their job. So I think we do need to make sure people are paid decently. But at the same time, I think local authorities can look for savings. I think AI, for instance, going forward offers real opportunities to reduce backroom staffing levels and undertake some functions without the same
cutting
headcount.
the backroom functions.
Well, I think those things are important, but at the same time, as I say, we're not going to overturn the legacy of local authorities being underfunded and having a broken system immediately. We're starting that work.
Well, you were a council leader yourself, weren't you?
It was very difficult under the Conservatives, money taken away year on year, and new responsibilities given to you, but we are going to reverse that.
Annabelle?
Well, I just ask again where the money is going to come from, and you know it's an important point that's been raised about the salaries of town hall fat cats. You know, how can you possibly justify spending some of these, paying some of these people £300,000-400,000 a year, 3 to 4 times what the Prime Minister is on, and yet there doesn't ever seem to be any accountability. You know, why are we not holding these people's feet to the fire when they're unable to stick to their budgets and when there's been massive amounts of waste? As I say, mismanagement is such an important part of this, and there are commitments that they must stick to, children's services and social care being the two big ones.
Yeah, but do we need to then change what councils are there to do? Are they a sort of crisis management centre in that sense, or should they just be doing things, important though they are, like bin collections?
I think we're seeing a bit of a paucity of ambition here, because I don't really think that the alternatives are kind of council tax or, you know, go after the salaries of people who, as Jim says, are providing vital public services. I think we need to be looking at a reform to council tax to look at progressive property taxation. I think we need to be looking at restoring the central government grants. And I also think that we need to be looking at the amount of money, the tax-raising powers that local authorities have. In this country, we have a highly centralised fiscal system. Most of the tax-raising powers sit within central government. That's abnormal if you look at lots of our peer economies across Europe. Could we be giving local authorities more flexibility in their tax-raising powers on top?
All right. Well, let's talk about the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch. She has been criticised by some for not setting out clear policies rather than just a sort of sense of direction for the party. She says she has time, but today, she has announced some specific proposals on immigration. She spoke to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, yesterday. Let's have a listen.
We need to make sure that UK passports are a privilege. Citizenship in our country are a privilege, not just a right. And we need to make sure that the people who are coming here want to have a real meaningful connection to the UK. So no criminal records, they should be net contributors to the economy, not relying on benefits, but people who care about our country and care about our communities.
Kemi Badenoch there. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Why has she announced these policies now, particularly?
Well, Joe, I think the Conservatives know that they are vulnerable on the issue of immigration. In 2023, net migration, which is to say the number of people coming to this country legally minus the number of people leaving, rose to record levels. It came down a bit in 2024, but still way above the tens of thousands that successive Conservative leaders promised. So Kemi Badenoch knows, and she's said previously in her short time as leader, that the Conservative Party failed in immigration. And I guess this is an attempt by her to have an early reckoning, early in her leadership, with that issue. More specifically, the Labour government is bringing forward some immigration legislation next week, so I think she's using that as an opportunity to make this her first policy intervention as Conservative Party leader.
Well, give us a little bit more detail about the policies that she is suggesting.
This is about indefinite leave to remain, which does what it says on the tin. It's the process by which a migrant who's come to this country can be told that they can actually stay here and work, study, do whatever they like for as long as they like. And usually they can apply for that after 5 years of living in this country, and then a year later, if they get indefinite leave to remain, they can apply for British citizenship. Kemi Badenoch is saying that that 5-year period before you can apply for indefinite leave to remain should be doubled to 10, and then after that there should be 5 years before you can apply for citizenship. So turning a 6-year process into a 15-year process. I think one interesting element to this is that record migration that we saw under the Conservative governments is obviously going to work its way through the system over the next few years, and you're probably soon going to see record numbers of applications for indefinite leave to remain, and then after that citizenship. So this is something I think that Kemi Badenoch is trying to get ahead of.
Right, Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. Yes, is this about numbers, about bringing down the record numbers that existed under the last Conservative government?
Yes, it is. And I think, you know, Kemi is having a very honest conversation with the country. She is saying to them that there are hard messages that we need to think about. We have to accept that despite best efforts to try and reduce the numbers of people coming into the country, the figures did go up. And we have to be honest about that and be honest about mistakes that were made. What Kemi is doing now is making sure that everybody knows that the policies that we want to bring in to reduce immigration to the country, this is the start of it, and this is about the fact that actually the government are introducing a bill on Monday, and we're going to use these policies as amendments that we will put into that bill to try and make that bill even stronger and achieve the aim of reducing the numbers coming into the UK.
But you haven't set a target on...
No, but we're saying there will be a target.
OK.
But it's really important, I think, that we have a set of policies that ensure that when people are coming to this country, they're contributing to our country. That's really important, because if we don't tackle this, the burden on our public services, on our social housing, is just going to increase and increase.
Right.
But sorry, Joe, could I just come in here? Because I want to make 2 points. The first is that this is, in effect, an anti-integration measure. This is very far from where the public is. If you poll the public, 2/3 of them say they want migrants that come and settle and integrate into their communities. What you're doing is making it harder for people to come here and lay down those roots. They're more likely to be transient and temporary. That's a bad thing. The second thing is I do want to address this issue of the so-called burden on public services that Kemi Badenoch also made in her remarks, because at the end of last year, we lost my younger sibling, and before they passed away, they actually spent time in NHS care. And so many of the people who looked after them, from the doctors to the nurses to the administrators to the cleaning staff, were people that weren't born in this country. And I just think when so many people across the world struggle to access healthcare, education, affordable housing, care for the elderly, childcare, what a privilege to live in a country where people want to come and contribute to our public services, to our construction workforce, to our food services. You know, I don't see this as a sign of British weakness. I see it as a sign of British strength.
Very sorry for your loss. Stuart, would you
well,
like
likewise.
to respond?
And, you know, and look, I used to work in the hospice movement. I know exactly how much we rely on all sorts of people helping run those incredibly important services. But they're the very people who are contributing to our society. They are earning a wage. They are paying their taxes. Absolutely, that is absolutely credible and what we expect to see. That is why we're saying, you know, that 10-year period, you can show that you are bringing a positive contribution to this country. But if you're not, then, you know, we have to be honest with the public that we can't keep on going like this. The numbers will just get too high.
What do you mean a net contributor then?
So if you're paying your taxes, you're paying your own way in life, that is something that I think we all want to see happen. And there are people in this country who can't get their social housing because there are huge demands on that. So this is being absolutely upfront with the public, saying to them, these are the conditions. And if you go to other countries, if you wanted to move to another country, they will often have exactly the same rules, that you have to prove that you are going to, you know, economically contribute to the country that you want to live in. Right. You can sustain your own life. Well, that is not, I don't think that's unreasonable.
Well, Jim, let me get your reaction and then we'll come back to the specifics around integration.
Well, I feel this is a pretty desperate attempt by an opposition leader who's failing to really register with the public at all to try and make herself relevant. I think it's an attempt to atone for 14 years in which we've had virtually an open border policy because people have arrived, particularly post-Brexit, arrived in much greater numbers than the government ever promised. 1 million people arriving net migration in the final year of the Conservative government. And much of what Kemi Badenoch has talked about, actually, there's very little substance to it. It's not going to stop people coming. We already have rules where, for instance, if you breach your visa conditions, you can be removed. If you give false information in your pursuit of an application for indefinite leave to remain, you can also have your status revoked.
But isn't this about both? Isn't this about the government and the opposition running scared of the political threat from reform? I mean, a number of Labour MPs, a number of your colleagues, the so-called Red Wall caucus, want Labour to be more vocal about immigration as a way of neutralising that threat. They are pressurising Number 10 to deal, as they see it, with immigration.
No, we're not running scared at all. It's about having clear rules, which we have, and then enforcing them. So, for instance, in the 6 months since Labour was elected, 16,500 people have been put on deportation flights who have no right to be here. So let's make that absolutely clear. We're processing asylum seeker applications much more quickly. We're looking to do a lot of work to smash the gangs which are resulting in the small boat crossings. It's actually about having a government that gets on with enforcing what's already there rather than thinking up new and elaborate ways to sound tough on this issue.
Annabelle?
I think it's an important and substantive measure that Kemi Badenoch has announced today. It shouldn't be controversial to expect people who are coming here to be net contributors. And unfortunately, in the 2022-23 wave, only around 5% of people who came to Britain to live and to work are believed to have paid in to the state more than they took out. Unfortunately, it's simply not financially sustainable for us to continue to have very large waves of people who are coming here who are not not going to be net contributors. The post-Brexit immigration system that was introduced by Boris Johnson has been a complete disaster in economic terms, and anything that we're able to do to try and row back from that and to move towards a system that is a lot more selective about, and one that helps us attract the best and brightest to Britain to come here and to work and to contribute and to pay their taxes, is the one that we should be moving towards. And it really is not unreasonable to say these things.
Yeah, I think unfortunately multiple panellists are drawing a bit of a false distinction here between this idea of kind of the contributor and the non-contributor. The first thing I'd say is that the majority of migrants are here with no recourse to public funds until they get indefinite leave to remain. That means they cannot access public benefits, so they have to work. Unfortunately, I think this myth spreads that there are many migrants who don't come and work because people look at the visas that are granted and they say, well, if the visa has work in the title, it means they're working. But if they come as dependents, for example, then they're not. But dependents work, students work because they have to, because they cannot get benefits. And in the same way that if you were a British family with a single wage earner and that wage earner was low paid, as you know, many people are claiming these migrants are coming there doing these really low paid, low skilled jobs, a British family couldn't make that maths add up to have just one earner supporting all of their dependents, students who come here. These people are working, they are contributing. And the fact is, the evidence shows that even when they come here and start on low incomes, those incomes catch up with the median earnings of the British population in general. I would also just point out that Kemi Badenoch herself is an example of someone who came to this country and flipped burgers at McDonald's and now holds high office as the leader of the opposition. So I don't think that we should foreclose the idea that people can start off in one particular life path when they come to this country and end up in another.
Annabelle?
The Office for Budget Responsibility recently modelled the profile of a low-skilled worker coming to Britain, low-skilled migrant coming to Britain, and estimated that if they arrived here at age 25, then by the age of 81, they will have cost the Exchequer 450 or around £450,000 over the course of their lifetime. Now, you just have to wonder how sustainable that is. Perhaps if we are able to grow the economy and perhaps if we're able to attract a sufficient number of extremely high-skilled migrants here, then we might look towards a more relaxed system down the line. But that certainly isn't simply not in the fiscal position.
But what about the number of people who work in the care sector, for example? They may not be low skilled, but they are low paid.
And people who come here to work in care often get immediate access to public services as well. They don't have that 5-year delay. Now, again, this is a product of the post-Brexit visa regime that was introduced under the last Conservative administration, which has been very problematic. I think what we need to do, just to your point, Joe, is increase wages in the social care sector so that we're able to attract more people who are here in Britain already into those roles, which currently they're simply not willing to do.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I think what we need to do is boost our investment in skills so that we can actually, as it were, grow our own, ensure that people in the care sector, for instance, they're upskilled, it's a decent career pathway, people are given the training they need to do the job well, and then if we've got UK citizens doing that, we don't need to have them on the protected occupations list and give people visas to come in. And I'm very pleased that one of the things the government's doing is creating Skills England, looking to invest more in skills so that we can grow these sectors, increase the number of apprenticeships which had fallen very badly, so that we actually don't need to have people coming from other parts of the world to do jobs that people in the UK could very happily do.
But making it more difficult to get citizenship, Kemi Badenoch and your party, are claiming that might act as a deterrent to people coming here. But what about the integration question? Because Kemi Badenoch said we need to demand that those who come here love this country and will maintain and uphold its traditions, not change them. It is not enough that they work hard and avoid crime. What you're suggesting by making it harder and a longer process to get citizenship is not going to aid that integration process, is it?
I don't see why it wouldn't. I mean, the reality is that, you know, I think she's absolutely right in saying that if you're going to come to this country, then, you know, you need to respect the traditions, the laws of the UK. They're long, hard fought, particularly you think of women's rights and LGBT rights. All of those things are really important and really held by this country as deep values. I don't see that it is wrong for Kemi to say that if you're coming here, you need to respect those British values.
Eleanor?
Again, I just raised the point that I made earlier, that in effect what you are doing is increasing the number of people who are here precariously, temporarily, that will have to come and go. And the public is just so clear that that's not what they want. Even if what you're saying is true about people needing to come to this country, respect and show their appreciation for it and all of that stuff, I do not understand why they cannot do that within the current window of current legislation, and why you have to expand the period, effectively just prolonging their precarity to somehow force them to show that they love Britain.
Why has she done it now, by the way? I mean, I asked that
because
question.
we've got the bill on Monday coming.
Right, nothing to do with reform.
No, and seriously, we have got this. Labour government bill is coming on Monday. We are putting down clear policies that we will put down as amendments to that bill as it goes through Parliament.
Annabelle?
I think it's quite difficult to square this idea that people in Britain are very open to and supportive of extremely high levels of immigration when you look at what's happening with the surge for reform. I think if voters were that relaxed, then there wouldn't be Labour and Conservative politicians coming out and feeling as though they've got to take the fight in them. It's reform which is saying that it wants to drastically bring down the numbers who are coming here. And I actually happen to think that if we do have a reduction, then that will enable better integration. I simply don't see how we will be able to integrate, 700, 800,000 people into our society and into our country and into our culture. It'd be much easier if we had lower numbers overall.
Let's have a look at this headline in BBC News. Turmoil as Trump and Musk take aim at top US aid agency. Elon Musk tasked with trying to cut public spending. The Trump administration reportedly intends to merge the US government's main overseas aid agency with the State Department, as workers were asked to stay out of its Washington headquarters. Let's have a listen to the Vice President, J.D. Vance, talk about how aid should be used and spent.
There's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about people outside their own borders. That is no way to run a society.
Eleanor, how do you respond to that?
I'm not sure what scripture J.D. Vance is reading, but my take on the parable of the Good Samaritan is actually that it's an act of Christianity to consider the entire mankind as your community. So that's my main takeaway.
Stuart, do you agree with J.D. Vance and the way he characterised it?
Well, look, I mean, I think this country has a very proud record on our international aid. We've done significant amounts of good work. But I think, you've always got to ask the questions. Is that money being spent wisely? Is it going to the right places? I want to see that being effective because it does actually help us with the soft power. I'm not going to comment on the exact bits of the Bible that he may be quoting. I'm not well enough qualified to do so.
Right, but just on the philosophy of it, I mean, you say that the UK has a good track record when it comes to international aid. It was certainly David Cameron, Conservative Prime Minister, who enshrined a commitment to spend 0.7% of national income on international aid. It was cut to 0.5%. The Labour Party pledged in the manifesto to bring it back up to 0.7%. When?
Well, I think international aid, when done properly, is a partnership between a country like the UK and a developing country in order to reduce poverty, reduce political instability and conflict, which are both very important, and actually reduce displacement of peoples, which is something we've just been talking about.
So when is it going to happen?
It's got to be spent properly, and I think we are ensuring that that's the case, and we will fulfil our manifesto pledge over time to get back up to
but it's not a priority. It's not a priority.
Income. Well, it will happen. We promised it will happen, and it will happen. And over the lifetime of the Parliament, we will get to 0.7.
Do you welcome that pledge?
No, I don't think that we should have a foreign aid target at all, because I think it leads to inevitable waste, and we've seen countless examples of that over the last decade or so, perhaps the most famous of which was when we spent a large sum of money helping Ethiopia create its own Spice Girls tribute band. I'm not sure that most people, particularly those who are struggling
Well, that was
here
an
in Britain,
example, of course. I mean, we're still giving a lot of money to Ethiopia. Do you not think we should?
I think that we ought to be giving humanitarian aid at times of acute crisis, but that if we're ultimately serious about alleviating poverty, then we ought to be trading with these countries and lowering barriers to trade. That's the way that we help them to grow and prosper and ultimately improve the living standards of those who are living in those countries. But no, I mean, that was one example, perhaps, as I say, the most infamous, but there have been many others. We spent a lot of money supporting rice production in China, for instance, which is one of the world's largest economies. And there were also stories of civil servants who were scrambling at the very last minute to try and spend all of the budget in time before the renewal of the year, so of their budget. So no, I don't think that we should have that. And I think that JD Vance also made an important point, which is that charity should begin at home, and that in a democracy that the government really ought to put the needs and interests of voters and taxpayers and those who contribute to the fabric of our society first.
Helena?
If I could just, I think sometimes in the foreign aid debate, what gets lost is the bigger picture that within living memory in the mid-20th century, what was stretching around the globe was not independent nations, but an empire. Britain literally owned large swathes of the world and was funneling money for hundreds of years, funneling resources from those areas to this country. So to me, the aid question is not about charity, it's not about benevolence, it's actually about moral obligation. It's actually about where is this conflict, where is this poverty, where is this instability, where is this, being hammered by the effects of climate change? Where is that actually because of the actions that we have taken, and to what extent are we expected to address this? And the other thing I would just say is that sometimes quibbling about the exact percentage of GDP we should spend, I think rather than thinking about the monetary figures, we should be thinking about the systems that were set up under empire that are remaining. We should think about the fact that if you take a region like the Caribbean, for example, paying billions of pounds to the IMF, to the World Bank, to sustain debts that are largely due to having to support populations that were left with poor public health and poor education after empire. It seems only right that Britain should be leading the fight to change those systems to make the world fair. So it's not just about moving money around the world, it's actually about how do we take our place on the world stage to build that progressive world and move away from the legacy of empire.
Do you agree with that, Stuart?
Well, look, I think I agree with the point that actually the obligation of any government is to make sure that we are looking after the people in this country first. And obviously, if we can then help other countries in need, but make sure that that money is properly going to the people that need it and not on some of the projects that we have seen. And my worry is that when you start to set a specific percentage of money that will have to go, do you end up then finding projects? Now,
Was reaching the 0.7% pledge under a Conservative government something that you were proud of?
Look, I think we made a promise to do so, but equally, when we realised that there were going to be difficult decisions and difficult decisions we have to make on the public finances, we had to make that difficult decision to then reduce it. That is something you have to do. You can't just, I think, constantly say you will always spend that amount of money on foreign aid, because it will be dependent on what the situation is like here. People do get, understandably, very angry if they are struggling with the cost of living, and then they see billions or millions of pounds being spent on things that really are not going to be the things that help directly the people in those countries.
If I could just address that point directly, actually, because billions of pounds of money does flow out of this country to other countries, and that's because under the Conservatives, starting with Margaret Thatcher, there was a sell-off of our public assets, things like our water industry, things like our energy system, and now foreign shareholders get money every time you pay a water bill, every time you pay an energy bill. And it seems to me that the only time that people start getting up in arms about it is when it's poorer countries around the world asking for their fair share.
Well, do you agree? Should poorer countries get their fair share? Should it be the systems and perhaps the past of the UK that should really direct what we do with that money?
Well, I think one thing that's really being missed in this debate, and is relevant to your question, Joe, is that whether it's 0.5% or 0.7%, offering, obviously well-directed, if there are examples of bad practice, they need to be eliminated, but offering this sort of support for countries to develop is a really critical part of soft power around the world. And what America and I think Annabelle are not understanding is if US withdraw, if the UK withdraw, China will be in there. And China will be seen as the country which supports developing countries, and actually our attempt to try to build an alliance around democratic values comes in under serious risk there.
Do you accept that question about China will perhaps step in if the soft powers roll back?
No, I think it's a bit of a straw man, and there's a suggestion that were we to lower the foreign aid budget, then it would turn us into an international pariah. Look, I think you need to bear in mind that around 95% of the foreign aid budget goes to governments internationally rather than to charities internationally, many of which are dictatorships. And it's very difficult to track those funds and to ensure that they are going towards the projects that ordinary people who are paying their taxes in Britain would want them to go towards. Look, at the time when Labour introduced the said it would be scrapping the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, it also recommitted to a pledge to spending £11.6 billion on overseas climate aid. How can it justify that?
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. Have a very good afternoon.